We all know some people that are just excellent communicators. They really stand out. It's easy to think they were born that way, or they just have some special skill that we don't. But that's a cop-out. Communication skills absolutely can be learned and honed. When you master communication, people see you differently. Everything you do becomes easier because people are more likely to support you and want to help you. And that makes a huge difference for your career. All you need is an open mind and a willingness to learn. I'm Dory Clark. I'm the author of The Long Game and Reinventing You, as well as a former presidential campaign spokesperson, where I learned firsthand the importance of getting every word right. Let's get started. It's ironic, but the more technology becomes a part of our everyday lives, emailing people all the time, interacting on social media, doing video calls and webinars, the more our interpersonal communication skills become critical. That's because there's more room for misunderstanding when we're not communicating face-to-face, and frankly, we have less practice getting it right than we did in the past when we didn't have any other options. So, wouldn't it be nice if we could solve communication problems before they started, before your words were misinterpreted or someone got the wrong idea or took offense? Well, there is something we can do up front that makes it far more likely that'll be the case, and that's investing time and energy in building rapport with other people. If you don't know someone that well, it's easy to miss clues in their communication or imagine the worst scenario. Did that email seem a little curt? Was she offended that you asked more questions of your other coworker during the call? You don't know, so you worry. But if you've already built a solid rapport with someone and created a sense of trust and mutual positive feeling, then they are a lot more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt when you're interacting with them. If they're troubled by something you've said, they'll probably ask you instead of secretly fuming. And if you make a mistake, as we all do sometimes, they'll probably be gracious about it because they understand you didn't have bad intentions. So how do we get there? The first step, according to eminent psychologist Robert Cialdini, is to find a commonality with them. It doesn't have to be huge or profound. It could be that you both enjoy sports, or you have dogs, or you live in the same neighborhood. But it's a good way to break the ice, give you something to talk about, and show that you can relate and you're on the same team. It's a building block that enables you to go deeper with them. Second, look for opportunities to be helpful where you can. If your coworker is struggling with a task or they're underwater with a big project, offer to lend a hand. Or if you have some insights or resources that could be helpful, share them. People remember that sort of kindness because frankly, it's rare, because people are busy or they just don't think of it. But if you're proactive in offering help, it creates a positive cycle in your relationship. Finally, something else that makes a big difference is really listening when you're engaging with that person. So often, especially at work, we're rushing around trying to meet deadlines and get things done, and relationship building takes a back seat. But that's actually counterproductive because it's the strength of your relationships that allows you to build trust and get more done faster. So when you're with that person, slow down. Don't multitask and try to answer emails while they're talking to you. Focus on what they're saying. Don't interrupt them and ask questions to draw them out. If it's of interest, I actually have a full LinkedIn Learning course on listening skills you can check out for more information. Honestly, it doesn't take that much to build rapport with your colleagues, but not enough people make the effort. So when you do, there's a powerful impact on your ability to connect and build rapport, which leads to better communication. Having a basic knowledge of nonverbal cues can definitely help you in the workplace. Does your boss actually like your idea, or is she just giving it lip service? Does your new acquaintance at the networking reception want to keep talking with you, or is he trying to get away? Nonverbal cues don't reveal everything, of course. They're one piece of data among many, and it bears mentioning that if you're neurodiverse, they may be harder to pick up on at times. But as long as you take nonverbal expressions as hints or pieces of information rather than the whole story, they can form useful nuggets you can compare against other sources to help inform you. Here are a few things to keep in mind. First, take a look at whether their body language is open or closed. If they're closed off, they may have their arms crossed or they're otherwise protecting their body. If they're open, their arms are free, their torso is exposed, and that's a sign of comfort and trust, just like it is for dogs or cats that let you rub their bellies. Now, a closed body posture could mean a number of things. Number one, most innocuously, it could mean they're cold. So if the heat's broken in your office, don't worry if your colleagues start doing this. But it could also mean they're feeling nervousness or hostility towards you in some way. Again, you have to compare it with other data, but it's worth noticing. Second, take a look at where your colleagues' feet are pointed. This is a subtle tell, but really useful in situations like parties or networking events. People's feet will usually point in the direction they want to be headed. So even if their upper body is pointed toward you, if their feet are headed out the door, they're not far behind. That's where their body is telling them they should go. Try to take note and respectfully wind down the conversation. Even if they're not consciously aware they want to be out of there, their subconscious will be grateful to you for not detaining them. Now, if you're communicating digitally, there's a little less information to go on. You're generally not seeing the person's full body, but maybe just the chest up. But there are a lot of nonverbal cues that we display on our face. One thing to watch for is mismatched expressions. If someone's smiling, but the corners of their eyes aren't crinkling, it may be a pro forma smile, one they don't really mean. It's sometimes hard to tell for sure, but it's one piece of information you can take in context. Another thing to be mindful of is subtle expressions of contempt. We all know what this looks like if you've ever been or been in possession of a teenager. Rolled eyes, smirking, or the like. Adults generally aren't so obvious about it, but if you see quick flashes of those behaviors, that's what psychologists call leakage, because people are generally trying to contain it, but it leaks out. Put on your observer hat, and if you notice something, even a quick moment, it can be extremely informative. Nonverbal expressions are subtle, but powerful. Learning to recognize and master them can help you understand far better where you really stand with your colleagues and clients. So next time, before you head into a meeting or pick up the phone or join a video call, slow down and ground yourself so you can pay attention and make the conscious decision to really see the person in front of you. Notice the tone of their voice and their expression in addition to the words they're using, because careful attention will tell you a lot about what they might be thinking or feeling, and it can help you see the most effective way to steer the conversation. Sometimes you can get away with ordering people to do things at work, but certainly not if they don't report to you, and even then, it's generally not a great idea, because they'll usually resent you for it. Instead, it pays to learn the art of making a request, because people feel a lot better about honoring a request than they do about following an order. So here's how to do it effectively. First, where possible, it's always a good idea to dig your well before you're thirsty, as the business author Harvey Mackay put it. In other words, try to invest in the relationship before you need something from that person. If you can be helpful to your colleagues when they need it, donating to their charity run or filling in for them in a meeting or editing a document for them, they'll be appreciative and far more likely to help you in the future. Next, in the moment when you do have a request, make sure you explain the context. Let's say you'd like them to stay late at work to help you finish up a report. If they don't know the full story, they may think you were just irresponsible and put it off till the last minute, so why should they help enable you? But if your boss requested urgent last-minute changes and the client meeting is tomorrow morning, they're far more likely to be sympathetic and helpful. You also want to be sure to acknowledge that their assistance is a favor. As long as you have a good relationship, people are often pretty willing to help out. Where you run into trouble is if they feel a favor, some special kindness they're doing for you, is being taken for granted. So make sure they know that you appreciate it and use those words. Thank you for the favor. It means a lot to me. It'll go a long way. Now, sometimes their help really is a pure favor, but other times the request you're making also helps them in some way too. For instance, maybe the report you're working on is key to getting a budgetary increase approved that'll benefit your colleague's department as well. And if that's the case, be sure to point that out. You don't want to be heavy-handed because they don't have to help you, but it can be useful to point out where your interests are aligned. For instance, you could say, thanks for your help with this. This report will be critical for the meeting tomorrow, and if we can get the new budget approved, it'll be terrific news for both of our departments. Finally, be sure you express your gratitude explicitly and specifically. Don't just say thanks. It means more if you detail exactly what they did and why it mattered to you. You could say, thanks so much for staying late last night. I know it was short notice and you're really busy. The edits you made to the report really tightened it up and made it more effective, and I couldn't have done the graphic work without you. You made the report a lot stronger, and I know the whole team appreciates it. The days of ordering people around are gone. Instead, we have to persuade them to want to collaborate with us. By following these steps, you can make requests more effectively and get your colleagues truly on board. Communication choices used to be simple in the old days. If someone worked in your office, you'd meet with them face to face. If they worked somewhere else, you'd call them or maybe mail them a letter or send a fax. But nowadays, the situation has gotten more complex. Do you meet face to face or in a video meeting? Do you call? Should you email? Text? Use a messaging app? There's a lot of choices. So how do you decide? The first question to ask yourself is whether the person you're communicating with has a clear preference. If someone is in a powerful position, like your boss or a valued client, and they have a strong opinion about how they like to communicate, honor it. Even if it's not the optimal way for you to do business or to use that medium, just do what they like. It's a good idea to keep them happy, so adapt to their preferences. But what if the person doesn't have a particular preference, or it's a colleague with equal standing that you don't need to bend over backwards for? In that case, here are a few questions to ask yourself to help you decide. First, is the situation time sensitive? It's a really good idea for any team to clarify their procedures around urgent or time-sensitive situations. If something needs to be addressed ASAP, who gets contacted and how do we contact them? It doesn't really matter what you decide, as long as everyone knows about it and is on the same page, because when you're in the middle of a crisis is the wrong time to figure that out. Next, is the conversation delicate? If what you're going to discuss is high stakes or emotional or is going to prompt a lot of questions, maybe you're reassigning someone to a new role or you need to ask for a leave of absence or someone's not getting a promotion, then it's best to find a way to have that conversation in real time. Whether you meet in person or through a video meeting or a phone call probably depends on geography or personal preferences, but it's a good idea to have the conversation live so that they can ask the questions that they'll almost certainly have. Having important conversations live is a form of respect for the other person so that they're not just worrying and having to wait for clarification. Next, will the conversation have a lot of give and take? If you're discussing ideas or brainstorming or troubleshooting, a real-time conversation is also helpful so you can get input from your colleagues. Interacting live lets you springboard off each other's suggestions and probe and test and refine your concepts fast. And is the information clear-cut? If you have a simple update to share, let's say the office holiday party is going to be Thursday at 5 p.m., or George is now going to be the point person for the recycling committee, that's perfect for asynchronous communication, like email or using a messaging app. It's useful for people to know, but it's definitely not an emergency. Are time zones an issue? In a global economy, most of us have probably had to get up early or work late to do calls or meetings with folks across the world. But that's really hard to do all the time. And to make work sustainable, it's best to use asynchronous communication like email or a messaging app as much as possible when you're working with teams in diametrically opposed time zones. Of course, we all need to get together live sometimes and iron out issues or just connect, but it's a kindness to keep that to a minimum if it's impinging on people's sleep. There's no magic formula for how to communicate best with your colleagues and clients. We're all figuring it out together. But with these strategies, you can make informed choices about the modalities that you're using. You're probably juggling multiple projects already. And if you're like most of us, your boss keeps throwing new ones at you. So how can you keep up, do a good job, and manage your supervisor's expectations? As with many things in life, the majority of problems can be avoided with a detailed conversation upstream, well before any actual deadlines. The first step is making a comprehensive list of the projects you're working on and rank ordering them based on your understanding of priorities. You then want to set up a meeting with your boss where you can confer and ask if your understanding of their relative importance matches hers. The last thing you want to do is waste time pushing hard on the 10th priority when number 1 is languishing. You have limited time and energy, and you want to expend it on the right things. So ask. Next, for each project, come up with a time estimate. How long do you realistically think it'll take you to complete it? For instance, creating the pitch deck might take 90 minutes, writing the client report might be 3 hours, and pulling together your department's annual budget might take 10 hours of work. Then you talk with your boss and match up those expectations. See if he thinks those are realistic estimates. And if you're wildly off, that can surface misaligned expectations early on. You might envision the departmental budget project as taking 10 hours and being hugely laborious, but maybe he just meant you should email everyone, ask him for some numbers, and pull together a spreadsheet, which would take an hour, not 10. Knowing that enables you to triage much more effectively and also push back where necessary. If you agree that writing a certain report will take 3 hours, but he wants you to do 30 hours worth of other project first, he's certainly not going to get that report on his desk tomorrow. Finally, make sure you know what the deadline is for every project. We may think we know or have an implicit understanding, but it pays to be explicit and know exactly what others are envisioning. You can't prioritize effectively if you don't grasp the real urgency or lack thereof behind a given task. Understanding deadlines gives you power to shift and adjust your schedule based on what's actually most important. Expectations are tricky. They're often unstated and often unrealistic. So having detailed conversations up front can help spare you confusion and dissatisfaction down the road because you know exactly where you stand. In one of my first jobs out of grad school, I worked for a boss that was never in the office. He was constantly networking, meeting people, attending conferences. That was great. Everyone knew him and liked him and wanted to do business with him. But it wasn't great for me because as his new employee, I didn't really know how things worked and couldn't seem to ever catch his attention long enough to find out. I'd save up detailed lists of questions and would try to get them in rapid fire when he called to check in once every day or two. It was a stressful way to learn my job. And I'm not the only one. Most bosses these days are incredibly busy, oftentimes too busy to provide regular guidance and feedback. So here are strategies to get the guidance you need from an elusive boss. First, even though it may be uncomfortable, it's important to sit down and have a meta conversation, meaning a conversation about how you have conversations. You can keep trying to get the information you need to do your job in 5-minute increments before your boss hops in a car or boards a plane. But it's a better idea to request a sit-down meeting where you're both able to be fully present. Bring up the fact that you have normal questions that arise in the course of doing your job, and because your boss is busy, it can sometimes be hard to get answers in a timely fashion. So what does she suggest as the best course of action? That's not accusatory, that's just reality. And any reasonable boss will understand that. See what she suggests and if it sounds feasible to you. Maybe it's a weekly meeting on Tuesdays, the day she's actually in the office. Maybe it's a daily check-in call or frequent emails she can answer from her cell phone. You can experiment and see what works, but it's essential to start the conversation. In addition to talking about how to address the regular questions that come up, it's important to develop an emergency plan. What happens if an irate client calls up when your manager is on a plane overseas and offline for the next 10 hours? What if there's a pressing media inquiry and he can't be reached? Brainstorm likely scenarios, or if not likely, at least plausible, and determine together what your strategy should be. Finally, think about creating an operating manual for your job. This will become a helpful reference guide for you over time, as it can remind you about how to handle certain scenarios. You can also give it to your boss to read and edit, so you know if you're on the same page about how to approach things. The guide will also be useful to whomever your successor is, and don't worry that creating it is going to put you out of a job. If they want to get rid of you, trust me, they'll do it anyway. But instead, creating a manual like this actually shows your initiative and makes it easier for them to promote you accordingly, because they know that there will be less of an adjustment period for the new hire, thanks to your onboarding guide. In a busy world, it's not always easy to get the guidance we need, but with these steps, you can get proactive, take control, and show your initiative. One of the great underappreciated skills in the workplace is the ability to ask the right questions. When I was working as the New Hampshire communications director on a presidential campaign, I had a staffer named Kumar, who was a truly fantastic employee. Part of the reason was a question he asked. What can I be doing that's most helpful to you right now? Now, I had been an employee before, and I'd never asked my boss that question. I had a clear idea in my head about what my job was, and I was going to do that. But what I didn't realize, and Kumar did, was that you can make yourself uniquely valuable and appreciated if you show that you're not just willing to do the tasks you think you were hired to do, but to go above and beyond in being helpful. Knowing that your priority is taking things off your boss's plate and helping them gives them existential peace, and they'll be incredibly grateful to you. Another great question to ask is, how should I prioritize that? We talked a little bit about this in the video on managing expectations, but it bears repeating. If you don't know how your boss is ranking different projects, you're flying blind. You have no idea if you're working on the most important task or the 20th most important task. And even if you're working hard, your effectiveness could be nil if you're not working on the right things. So be sure to ask upfront and often to see what your boss cares about. Then do that. Another great question to ask is, do you see anything I'm missing? Here's why. Most bosses, except for the pathological micromanagers, don't want you bothering them all the time, asking them how to do something. They want you to figure it out. They want to give high-level instructions, and then you go develop a plan and execute it. They simply don't have time to plan it all out for you, so asking them to do so is counterproductive. However, it's always a good idea to get your boss's feedback and input before you're too far down the road. So a great compromise then is for you to come up with a written plan or a slide deck, if that's a relevant option, explaining how you plan to approach a given problem or project that you're working on. Then you can run it by your boss early on and ask, do you see anything I'm missing? You're not making them do your job for you. You've come up with a plan. But you're also being inclusive and benefiting from their wisdom because they may, indeed, see some gaps that hadn't occurred to you. You get their buy-in and the idea improves too. Often in the workplace, we think the key is having the right answers and looking smart. But the truth is, we can often get further by asking the right questions in the first place. It can be hard to get the balance right of when to listen and when to speak at work. You don't want to talk just for the sake of it or to take up so much space in conversations that others can't share their thoughts. But you also don't want to be so quiet that others wonder why you're even there because you're never contributing to the conversation or sharing your ideas. So how can you strike the right balance? Here are some ways to think about it. A great time to listen is when you don't know the context of a situation. Let's say you're new at your job or you've just joined a project team that's been together for a while. They have a shared history and they know what's been tried before and what worked and what didn't. There are also likely complex dynamics that you're not aware of between people on the team or between different departments. If you come in with all the answers, you're likely to get knocked down fast because you don't understand the background. In that situation, sit back and listen so you can have the knowledge to speak authoritatively later on. Another good time to listen is when you don't have a strong opinion. If half the team is passionate about option 1 and the other believes it should definitely be option 2, don't take up airspace if you don't have something to contribute. If you happen to see holes or virtues in one of their arguments, by all means dive in. But if you could go either way, let the advocates debate and you can learn. On the other hand, you should definitely speak up when you have relevant experience to offer. You may have just joined a new project team, but if you worked on a similar project in the Asia-Pacific region, for instance, you're doing a disservice to everyone if you don't share that. That's not to say that the new team will or should adopt everything you did before, but it's useful for you to talk about what you did so your team members have more data at their disposal. Even if you don't have applicable personal experience, you should speak up if you have useful resources to share. Maybe you read an article in the Harvard Business Review that applies perfectly to your team's situation. Now would be a time to mention it. Another good time to speak up, and this is the flip side of a point I mentioned earlier, is when you do have a strong opinion. If you believe your company or your team is heading in the wrong direction, you have an obligation to let others know, even if they don't want to hear it. After all, why are you here? It's not to be a yes man. It's because someone hired you because they believed you had an important perspective to share. So even if it's not popular, share it. If you think the merger will fail, say it. If you think the change in accounting policy will get you in trouble with the SEC, say it. People may disagree or you may be overruled, but you'll feel better about yourself and you'll have done your duty to your company if you say your piece openly and honestly. Finally, another good time to speak up is if you can ask an incisive question. Speaking doesn't always have to be about pontificating or sharing your view. It can be about eliciting others' ideas and perspectives, and that can add to everyone's experience. It's an art, learning when to talk and when to listen. But if you master it, you'll win the respect of everyone around you. Communicating with your colleagues can be complicated. Some are incredibly blunt, and others are so subtle it's hard to understand what they're getting at. Some only focus on the exact words you say, while others are constantly hunting underneath the surface to see if there's a hidden meaning. We all have our own communication style and tendencies, and it can be complicated even further when folks come from different countries or cultures and may have different expectations about how to communicate. What's most important is to treat each person as an individual and recognize that if you take the time to understand how they personally like to communicate, it's a lot easier to make sure your message is getting through. Here are a few quick tips based on work I've done with my colleague, Brandeis University professor Andy Malinsky. First, it's useful to consider whether your colleague emphasizes relationship building in business or straight-up transactions. Some people don't feel a need to have a personal relationship with you in order to do business with you. As long as you conduct yourself fairly and ethically, you can get the deal done. And they may even actively avoid getting too personal. You've heard the saying, don't mix business and pleasure, or don't do business with your friends. That's what those folks would argue. But for other people, there's much more emphasis on personal relationship building. Maybe the client wants to go out to dinner with you and hear about your family and your background. Business and personal life aren't so separate. In their case, the business deal is the culmination of building that personal connection. If you have a colleague with that worldview, it may pay to take the time to get to know them. Invite them out for meals, learn about their family, and you'll build a lot more trust. Another key difference is how direct someone's communication style is. If your colleague is really direct, they may say, the project's in trouble. It's not going to be ready on time. Some people might interpret that as being aggressive, but in their minds, they're just being clear. Meanwhile, you have a middle ground where people might say, I'm really concerned about the project. The timetable may slip. And if someone is a more indirect communicator, they may place a lot of value on being delicate and not offending you. In that case, they may say something like, "The team is working very hard, but the timeline may be difficult." That's the same information, but conveyed in very different ways, and it may be easy to misinterpret if you're not looking for it. So be aware. Another area to keep in mind is the person's level of formality versus informality. Some people in some corporate cultures are pretty informal, whether it's dressing casually or calling the CEO by their first name. In other cultures, there's much more deference to superiors, and you're likely to use their titles at work, like Chairman so-and-so or Ms. X. Acting too informal in that context might make you appear cocky or presumptuous. We all come with different expectations around communication and what's appropriate, but having an awareness of these differences can help you communicate with more confidence and increase the chances that your intended message will get heard. Let's say you're in a meeting. You get interrupted. Fine. But a little later you speak up and get interrupted again. If that keeps up, most of us are likely to go in one of two directions, either retreating into silence or getting mad and lashing out. The frustration is understandable, but as you can imagine, neither reaction is a great idea. So here's what to do instead. First of all, it's useful to step back and ask yourself, why are you being interrupted? Sometimes people are rude. They're not really listening to you, or they're so eager to talk, they don't care what anyone else is saying or doing. But other times, interruptions can actually be a sign of interest and engagement. If they're interrupting to ask for more details or with a clarifying question, that can actually be a good sign that they care about the topic and want to learn more. Another useful thing to look at is whether you're being interrupted by just one person or by lots of people. If it's the latter, it may just be your company culture, which isn't a great thing, but it also shouldn't be taken as a personal insult. You need to contextualize what's happening in order to know what to do about it. If it's one person interrupting you, it may be time to sit down with them and have a conversation about how you have conversations. You could go to your colleague and say, "Bob, I know we both want our meetings to be as effective as possible. I've noticed, though, that it seems like when I speak in the meetings, you're interrupting me pretty frequently. Last Tuesday, it actually happened 3 different times. That made it hard for me to get my points across. I'm sure that's not intentional, and I wonder if there's a way we could strategize about that." Odds are your colleague doesn't even know he's doing this and may well be contrite. If he gets defensive, "I didn't interrupt you," then you can say, "Well, it was my perception that you did. Maybe I'm wrong. Is there a signal or a system we could use in the future in case something like that happens to come up again?" If it's actually your whole office culture, if everyone's interrupting everyone all the time, then you may need to find a way to disrupt the system. You could go to your boss, note your observation that people interrupt each other frequently, and ask if she's also noticed that. If she has, you have a starting point. If not, you could suggest appointing an interruption monitor to record instances for a couple of weeks to see if it's a frequent problem or not. Once you've established that it is, you may be able to suggest modifications that can help ensure more people's ideas get heard, like doing the bulk of brainstorming individually prior to the meeting, or empowering the meeting facilitator to stop interrupters and put the focus back on the previous speaker until she finishes. It's annoying when you get repeatedly interrupted, but it doesn't help anyone if you blow up or shut down. Instead, use these strategies to get at the root of the problem. It's easy to get defensive when you're feeling criticized. Why wouldn't you? But it's not great for your career to be known as the person who can't take feedback. Here's how to prepare yourself in order to receive feedback calmly and professionally. First, one important thing up front is knowing who to take feedback from. There are a lot of people out there in the world that have an opinion, whether it's about how you dress or your accent or your public speaking skills. The best way to avoid getting worked up about people's comments is to decide in advance who's worth listening to. Largely, this boils down to 2 categories: your boss and people whose feedback you ask for. Just about anyone else who gives unsolicited advice, no matter how well-intentioned, should be ignored. I'm actually a hardliner on this because we'd never make any progress if all we did was try to adapt to please people, because most people have different opinions. It should be green. No, it should be red. And most people think they're far better informed than they really are. If you respect someone enough to ask for their feedback, then listen. Otherwise, don't. You know your public speaking coach knows what she's talking about. The random audience member quite likely does not. Next, repeat this mantra. Don't respond immediately. People often go into fight or flight mode when they feel threatened. And let's face it, criticism is a form of threat. So they get defensive and want to go on the attack. They'll either try to smash down the feedback. I don't come into work late. That was one day and I was sick. 99% of the time I'm there early. Or they attack the person giving the feedback. The only reason the presentation wasn't as good as it could have been is you didn't get me the numbers on time. That's not helpful. Promise yourself that unless you had time to prepare for the feedback in advance, like a pre-planned performance review, you won't respond in the moment, and maybe not even that day. Just say, thank you for the feedback. I'd love to respond to this, but to do it justice, I want to think about it for a while. Then stop. If you know the feedback is coming and you can prepare in advance, it's often a good idea to try to map out the worst case scenario. That way you're ready if it comes your way, and if it doesn't, that's good news. For instance, let's say you feel like you might be on shaky ground with your boss. Odds are you probably know why. Maybe she thinks you're late too often, or she's talked to you in the past about your presentation skills or how you've handled a particular client. Write down all the things you're worried she might say. Now, write out draft responses when you're calm so that in the heat of the moment and you're feeling flustered, you can fall back on that for what to say. For instance, it's useful to acknowledge where you agree she has a point. Maybe you were late a few times last month, and let her know what you're doing or have done to change that. Maybe it's true that public speaking isn't really your forte at this point, but you've signed up for Toastmasters. Showing that you've thought about these points and are taking action makes a difficult conversation go way better. It's never easy sitting there and getting criticized to your face, but as long as the person is someone who ought to be giving you feedback, meaning your supervisor or someone you respect enough to ask for it, then it's for your own good and it will help you get better. As long as you can reframe it that way and try to calm your body down enough to listen, the process can help you become the kind of leader that you want to be. I'm an introvert, and maybe you are too. In fact, studies show that somewhere between a third and a half of people are introverts, but the workplace is still disproportionately optimized for extroverts. After all, in almost all work environments, the people who get rewarded are the ones who constantly speak up in meetings, who network all the time, and can't seem to get enough of socializing. That's great for them, but if that's not your nature, and it's certainly not mine, what can you do? You've probably tried faking it and forcing yourself to act like an extrovert. Don't do that anymore. It's miserable. Here's what to try instead, and how to speak up in a way that feels true to you. First, understand that being an introvert isn't a pass to avoid speaking up. Oh, I can't do that. I'm an introvert. That's just an excuse. But what you can do is start making a conscious effort to play to your strengths. A major area where this comes up at work is in meetings, where you often have to jostle to make a comment and fend off other people. But instead of doing that, here are a few ways you can make sure your voice gets heard. One possibility is, once you get your hands on an agenda for the meeting, to share your thoughts in written format beforehand. Now, that's not always relevant or appropriate, but if you have special expertise or want to go more in depth, you could circulate an email beforehand that gives people context and which allows you to make an impact in your own way. Another possibility is to enlist a trusted friend to help you out. And if they're also an introvert, you could offer to do the same for them. It can be hard to push yourself into the fray and say, I have a comment. But it often feels more natural to advocate on behalf of someone else. So your friend could jump in and say, Sarah looks like she's been trying to say something. Sarah, what's your perspective? Then you have the floor, and it feels a lot more comfortable to speak. This may actually be easier with video meetings, where you have the option of raising your hand icon to queue up to speak or ask a question, whereas in face-to-face meetings, people are more likely to just jump in, which can feel harder or like you have to be more aggressive. You can also create talking points for yourself beforehand so you know what you want to say. When you're on the spot, it's common to freeze up. But if you've already created notes for yourself, you can glance at them as a fallback and be a lot more confident in speaking up. If you want to push your boundaries, which isn't a bad thing to do periodically, you could also challenge yourself. In this meeting, I'm going to be the first one to speak up. That has the benefit of surprising your colleagues, who may have grown accustomed to having you not talk that much. It's always a good thing to keep them guessing and wondering, what other talents does she possess? If you do plan to jump in first, which is often easier because there's usually a little delay before anyone speaks up or raises their hand, it's a good idea to couple that with the previous suggestion of creating talking points beforehand so you're ready in the moment and don't have to wonder, what am I going to say? Another complementary strategy is to do more pre-work, meaning if speaking up in meetings is challenging, you can often accomplish the same thing, perhaps even more effectively, by having one-on-one meetups prior to the official meeting. If you're advocating for a certain course of action, a short pre-meeting allows you to set the context, see if your colleague is supportive, and make your case away from the fray. That puts you in a better position once the meeting actually happens to have them on your side and help advocate for your position. If you're an introvert, it's kind of like being left-handed. Society just isn't organized for our benefit, so you have to create some workarounds. But it's certainly not impossible. In fact, it's not even that hard to communicate effectively as an introvert if you deploy some or all of these strategies. Unfortunately, it's inevitable that at some point you'll face a tense situation at work with a colleague or an employee or your manager. So how can we handle it with grace so it doesn't fracture the relationship, but instead, hopefully, helps you reach a better understanding and maybe even get to a positive place? Here are 4 things to keep in mind. The first is to do your best to stay calm and composed. When you're in a tense situation or there's conflict, your body goes on high alert. It's natural to feel defensive or upset. After all, cortisol's racing through your bloodstream, and in a fight-or-flight situation, you might be tempted to storm off or lash out or behave in a way that you might regret later. But take a deep breath, which actually does help calm your nervous system, and as a starting point, try to focus on the facts rather than your immediate emotional reaction, because there's a possibility you might be reading the situation wrong, or there's more context that would be helpful. Which leads us to the second point. Work to actively listen to and try to understand the other person's perspective. Conflicts often happen because of miscommunication, so it's really important to make sure that's not happening here. Test your assumptions and ask questions until you're sure you understand the situation and how they view it. It's possible you have diametrically opposed views or agendas, but it's also possible you're on the same side and just talking about things differently, so you want to suss that out quickly. Next, once you understand the situation, it's important to make sure you're sharing your perspective in a clear and respectful way. For instance, it's always a good idea to use I statements to talk about what you're feeling and experiencing. So instead of saying, "you're wrong," you could say, "I have a different perspective," or "I'd like to understand your perspective better. Can you elaborate?" That helps keep the other person's defensiveness at bay, because you're not attacking them or criticizing them. You're just sharing your own views. Treating them with respect, even when it's a tough conversation, is a sign of professionalism that they'll remember. And finally, there's sometimes a temptation to keep talking about the conflict. And you obviously need to, up to a point, in order to understand the situation and how everyone views it. But there's a difference between understanding the facts and endlessly relitigating them and arguing about them. Once the scope of the disagreement is clear, it's useful to make a conscious shift into looking for solutions. What can you actually do to solve the problem or make the situation better? There's almost always something that can be done, even if it's small or just an initial step. It'll probably involve compromise and may not be perfectly satisfying to everyone, but it's a lot better of an option than just continuing to argue. It's never easy to communicate in stressful situations where there's conflict, but it's a skill we do have to master. And if you develop real expertise in finding a respectful path forward, even when you disagree with someone, that's one of the most valuable skills you can have because it means you can get through almost anything. We communicate every day with colleagues and supervisors and clients. Unfortunately, because we're all human, that means our interactions are often ripe for misunderstanding. But if you're aware of the ways that communication can be derailed, then you can prepare in advance, mitigate potential problems, and quickly discover and fix any crossed wires. In the internet era, interpersonal communication skills matter more, not less. If you can invest just a bit of time in improving your knowledge and honing your abilities, it gives you a critical edge. With these strategies, you can become more effective at work and more likely to connect positively with your colleagues and everyone around you. Let me know how it goes, and you can access hundreds of free articles and other resources on my website at doryclark.com. Good luck.